interesting presentations lined up for this session. The first is Pacific Labor Mobility Survey, key findings from the first wave, and this is one of the first surveys of its kind on Pacific labor mobility. The report hasn't been published yet, so we are very privileged to be seeing some of the first results from this from the survey that was conducted by the World Bank in collaboration with the ENU. And we'll have Ryan Edwards and Dung John from World Bank presenting this. The second presentation is on labor market impacts of low skill temporary migration, evidence from seasonal worker program. And the third presentation is on temporary migration and household spending in the Pacific. And in the interest of time, given that we are starting 10 minutes late, each presenter will have 15 minutes so that we have enough time for questions and answer and discussion. And then we finish on time for lunch at 12 p.m. So I'll now invite Ryan to come and present the first paper. Thank you.
You guys? Okay. Bulavanaka, good morning, everybody, and thank you for sticking around for the third day of the conference. This morning, we are going to share with you some early findings from a large systematic quantitative data collection exercise we've been doing that was born a few years ago now and is just coming to fruition. It's a collaboration between the Development Policy Centre and the World Bank. We are just a selection of the team and let alone the broader team that have been putting this together. And today we're going to focus on findings from the worker survey and social impacts, given all that we've been hearing about them, bringing some new data and some new evidence to this discussion. So understanding the impacts of labour mobility in the region, I might open with a little bit of background on that. Past research, as many have pointed out, especially a lot of that that we've done has focused on the economic gains. Especially in terms of income and remittances. And so some of the most important studies on this I've just put up here. So the one that really sort of put the evidence out there to start with was on the impacts of the RSE scheme, highlighted just how cost effective it was relative to a lot of aid programs in terms of development outcomes. Then the Pacific Possible report from 2016 did some big macro level calculations to quantify what the broader sort of welfare gains could be from more small L liberal migration policies. Then in 2017, data was collected from SWP workers, which we'll be relating some of our findings today back to look at the impacts of the SWP in sending communities. And then just last year, Zung and her team did a survey during the middle of COVID, which really highlighted how important remittances were for resilience and for managing the shocks from the lockdowns and other things. But there's a very common perception out there that we know that there's social costs, we know there's social impacts, but there's a common perception that they might be net negative, that when thinking about these, they're net social costs rather than the benefits potentially outweighing them. And with the recent growth of the schemes, there's been many allegations of exploitation and concerns about welfare and social impacts, but not really any large-scale, rigorous quantitative data on these issues. A lot of it has been sort of filtered through reports or cases that arise. We don't know what's really the extent of that on the ground. But until now, largely. So what the Pacific Labour Mobility Survey does, it's the first and only, to our knowledge, independent large, we'll say independent, we're academic researchers. So we don't really care what our findings say. We just want to do the data. Quantitative data on a wide range of social and economic indicators on workers across all three schemes. So we've got comparative data now. All the other ones we've focused on one single scheme in either one country, two countries, and so forth. And households, and a generous sample of non-sending households to also compare against and understand some basic stats back in communities. And the main contribution here, I think, is that by asking this many people their perceptions and their views on the schemes, we can offer some unique insights. It's a bit more generalized. It's a bit more general. It gives us a good idea of some systematic patterns out there, rather than a few sort of anecdotes and case studies that tend to pop out with quite a lot of selection bias through them. And the quantitative data, it's worth stressing, is also complemented by hundreds of in-depth interviews that the World Bank have done in parallel through a large study on gender that's about to be coming out soon, which largely comes to the same findings, which of course is reassuring. So just today, we're going to share a selection of the findings from the worker data, and we're going to focus on the workers' perspectives and on their views on social impacts in communities. So a quick preview, what do we actually find, in case anyone wants to leave or falls asleep during my presentation? The majority of workers are very satisfied when you ask them how they're doing across a variety of different types of satisfaction questions overall and across many specific dimensions. And importantly, we haven't really found any big deterioration as the schemes have grown, as the number of allegations has grown, and importantly during the pandemic, which I think is quite reassuring and a bit of a good news story. And social outcomes on balance, when we ask people what they're seeing and when we look at some estimates on impacts of these as well, also appear to be quite positive. There's definitely issues. There's a lot of challenges that could be improved and areas for improvement and some huge problems. But on balance, there's also a lot of social benefits and impact benefits that are worth bearing into mind. And yes. And the aggregate data does mask details of specific cases, which is, I think, where the qualitative work is really, really helpful. I'm not particularly pro-qual, pro-quant, but they serve very different purposes. So it's important that we use both. And lastly, the PLMS does corroborate a lot of the prior evidence on economic gains related to income, expenditure, and remittances, some in some quite big ways. So looking at the effects on incomes, so per capita incomes in receiving households of participating migrants, we find that basically quite big expenditure gains and more savings, not that much more by way of investment. But if we go to actually the wage earning gains, we do get some striking new figures. So the place premium is a concept which actually Michael, who we heard from before, had coined. And it's the idea that if we take a single worker with a single set of skills doing a single job and we move you to somewhere else, how much more can you earn simply due to the place? So what we can do with our survey data, we can understand what the earnings profiles of people based on their characteristics are in the non-migrant sample of individuals, what the determinants of them are, and then go and use all the workers who are abroad to figure out what and predict what their earnings would have been when they're at home. And so for Tonga, we find that place premium is about 3 or 4 times, but for Vanuatu, it's a striking almost 10 times. So the pattern that this seems to show us is that actually, as you move to areas that tend to have lower domestic earnings, the gains tend to multiply, which is also not that surprising. But here you see the median earnings from, say, the PLS, which is actually a bit less than in SWP and RSE. Against the predicted earnings profile of everyone back home. And it's quite huge. Now, a bit onto the details. So this is the first wave of what we hope will be a panel data set, which will be the first panel for the region. It's a long-standing collaboration between us, and the idea at the start was to really try and address many shortfalls in the Pacific migration and the broader data landscape, especially with respect to survey data. These shortfalls refer to, as I just mentioned before, fragmentation, availability. Sometimes this stuff exists, but it's notoriously difficult to access. Coverage in terms of the questions and the content, comparability across years and across time. So we've got consistent instruments, content, and the quality and rigor. And of course, the lack of longitudinal data. Migration is one of those issues where we've got repeat migrants, life cycle impacts that you can't really tell with the single one-shot survey. So the goal here is to really track people over time and understand these life cycle impacts. We cover five countries, 3 sending, 2 receiving. And so this is just this, so it's a bit blurry because I did use the snipping tool. But the PLMS itself is a quantitative survey that has workers and households. And as I mentioned, it's split between non-participating and participating. And the 3 countries are Tonga, Vanuatu, and Kiribati. And then the workers themselves are employed either in RSE or short stay and long stay PALM, previously SWP and PLS. Or they've returned home recently. in the worker survey. Data collection itself, emphasized at the start that it was very voluntary, strictly confidential and objective, and it took us a long time to get to the sample sizes that you see below. It's collected by experienced survey firms under a lot of supervision using the total survey error framework, where we try and minimize errors in every potential phase of collection. And there was a lot of QA built in as we did it, through monitoring as it started, as it went going, at all stages. The worker survey itself happened from December to March, just gone, and was based in Australia and New Zealand with some select return participants as well. And the household survey was done face-to-face in Tonga, largely before COVID hit. Then we moved a lot of things to phone-based, and so had to do a lot of tweaking into the methods and the design and how things happened. The sample sizes we got to in the end, over 2,000 workers, 1,000 or so from Vanuatu, 700 from Tonga, and just under 250 from Kiribati. 1,455 sending households, many of which were able to be linked to the workers, which is interesting to see what's happening on both the worker and the household reports of the same things, and 1,626 non-participating households. And to get to here, we had to combine a variety of different sampling approaches. So some key features of why this survey is a bit different to what's been done in the past. So it's going to be the first longitudinal panel data set done for the region ever, essentially. This doesn't actually exist in the Pacific, which is quite unfortunate. It's a big limit for quantitative researchers trying to do research. We've got a nice control group. So you can't, if you just go and ask people their experiences and only work with people who are exposed, there's a gamut of biases that can lead you to the wrong conclusion. So it's important that we do have a comparison group to compare people to. We've got detailed information that helps to sort of allow you to come closer to a causal interpretation on that with respect to their selection into the schemes. It's an omnibus nature. We framed it as the omnibus survey for a while to start, because it covers a lot of things, because we want it to be general purpose and an important resource for other people to use by making it open access. So carefully de-identifying everything and then making it freely and public available through our websites. So I'm going to hand over to our colleague Zung, who's actually going to talk through what are the results and takeaways.
Thank you, Ryan. So for the sake of time and following up on the snapshot of the key result that Ryan presented earlier, let me provide a bit of the specific details result that we have found from the first wave of this survey, with a focus on worker perspective, as well as the social impact of these schemes. Okay, let me go to this slide first. So in this survey, we did ask the workers to rate their overall experience in their host country on the scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being not satisfied at all, and 10 being extremely satisfied, and 5 being just okay. We did ask this same question in previous survey exercise. One was during the COVID phone survey conducted by the World Bank in 2020, and the other was doing the impact evaluation of the SWP scheme back in 2015. And over time, the response that we got for this question was highly consistent. We didn't observe any meaningful deterioration over time. The majority of the workers rate their experience on average around 8 or above. And we got consistent results across the PLS, the SWP scheme, as well as the RSE. The result vary a little bit across nationality of the workers, as well as the gender, or whether they are first-time participant or return workers. But overall, the majority of them are very satisfied. They give very high ranking on their overall experience in the host country. And this time during this survey, we did a little bit more details. We asked them to rate how satisfied they are with their current jobs, again on a scale from 1 to 10. And this is the result that we get. The satisfaction with the current jobs is really high. On average, across all the scheme and nationalities, the score that they gave is about 8, slightly, just less than 8 a little bit. And there's some variation across nationality and scheme as well. It seems that Ni Vanuatu workers were the least satisfied relatively compared to Tongan and Kiribati. And the SWP workers were relatively less satisfied. But overall, as you can see here, the average score that they gave is still about 8 or 7 or 8. Okay, then we go a little bit deeper and we ask them about their working condition. It's not just about the job, but their current working condition, and see whether they are satisfied or not. So when we ask them, are you satisfied with your current work conditions? 93% of them say yes, only 7% say no. This is a minor number, but again, it's not trivial. And when we dig a little bit deeper to ask them, why are they not satisfied with their current working conditions? And the majority of these 7% point out to high or non-transparent deductions of their salary, lower earning than their expectation, inconvenience working hours, and some of them also complain about physically demanding jobs. Very few of them complain about work safety protection. And again, we see some variation across the scheme. The gray area here are for the RSE scheme. The orange are SWP and the blue are PLS. Okay. We also ask workers specifically, how do they feel about being treated by their employers? The specific question is, during this particular trip, have you been fairly treated by your employers? And the vast majority of them say yes. As you can see on the graph here, across nationality, across the scheme, more than 80% of them, in some cases, for example, in I.T.S PLS workers, almost all of them say yes, they feel they have been fairly treated by their employers. Again, there is some variation across nationality and schemes, but the variation is relatively minor compared to the overwhelming positive perception of how they have been treated by the employer. And in complementation to this quantitative survey, the World Bank conducted qualitative survey work related to social and gender impact. And we did find complementary and supportive finding from the qualitative interviews. We find extensive qualitative, we find through the in-depth interview, we found that workers were generally satisfied with the work. Some of them raised concern about fluctuating working hours over time. Most of them, again, consistent with the quantitative data, felt that they are treated fairly by their employers. There were, of course, a few instances of bullying and harassment being reported by the workers. Some female workers found that their contract were too long and inflexible, even for seasonal short-term works, and did not want to be separated from the family for so long. And then there were concerns raised about health insurance and access to health services in the host country. Employers in particular felt that the coverage of insurance related to pregnancy was inadequate. I would also want to acknowledge that my colleagues who has been leading the qualitative work on social and gender impacts, Kirsty Petru, is sitting in the audience today as well. So if you have more questions on this, you can ask her during the lunch break. Okay, so in our survey, we did ask about the number of hours that worker works and how much do they earn after deduction and after taxes. So when we look at, how much do they work overall on average in the last 7 days, all of them work full time, that is 40 hours per week, and some of them work more than 40 hours a week. And as you can see on the graph here, across the scheme, across nationalities, the lowest is 39.5 hours per week. And then in some other cases, the average is 50 hours, like for RSE Vanuatu workers. And the net earning by country and by scheme, this is the figures that we got, again, across scheme and across nationalities. This is the amount that they earn per week or last week after taxes and deduction. This is all in Australian dollars, by the way. Okay. So when we asked the workers whether their earning met their expectation, the majority of them say yes, their earning expectation was met. So as you can see on the graph here, the blue colors represent more than expected. The orange are same as they expected, and gray are less than expected. So the majority of them, say their earning met expectation or even exceed the expectation. Vanuatu workers seems to be the group with least satisfied with their earning expectations, because they have the highest share saying that earning has been less than what they expected. Even though still, even for Vanuatu, the overall share of those who are happy with their earnings are still very high. Satisfaction with accommodation is also very high as well. As you can see on the graph, across the scheme and nationalities, more than 80% of workers are happy with their current accommodations. However, through the in-depth qualitative interview, There were some critical areas for improvement that was revealed, especially related to gender segregation in accommodation. So for both male and female workers, most of them feel that mixed accommodations are culturally inappropriate for them. And some employers were aware of this fact, and some of them won't hire female workers because they can't provide gender separate accommodation, and this affect the ability of female workers in the Pacific to participate in the scheme. Dissatisfaction with deductions is high. This is what Ryan mentioned earlier. When we ask whether the worker consider the deduction is excessive or unfair, on average, across all the scheme, about more than half of them say, yes, they think it's excessive or unfair. And there is some variation here, with the lowest share saying yes among Tongan RSE workers, and the highest was Ni Vanuatu in the SWP scheme. And again, Ni Vanuatu workers across the scheme seem to be the one with least satisfaction with deduction. Many of the workers are interested in changing employers. On average, overall, about 40% of them say that they would prefer to work for a different employers if given a chance. But I want to give a caveat here. Preference to work for a different employers does not necessarily mean that they are unhappy with the current employers. It might just be because they are aware of higher pay or different kind of job somewhere else that they want to try. And we don't have the details, nuanced result fighting on why do they want to change the employers at the moment. Many workers want to migrate permanently. As you can see on the graph, the blue are the share of workers who want to move permanently with their family to the host country. The orange are those who want to work for at least another seasons, then return home. And the gray are those who want to just return and stop working after the current season that they are working on. So the majority of them want to either work a little bit more before going home or move permanently. I think what's interesting here is even among the Ni Vanuatu workers, who seems to be the least satisfied group across the nationalities, many of them still want to come back and work before they go home permanently. And I guess this is an indication of them seeing the values and the benefit for themselves out of this scheme. On social impact, we did ask the workers. We asked the household who remain at home, as well as the household who do not participate in this scheme in the same communities, on how do they perceive the impact of these labor mobility scheme on themselves, their family, and their communities. And the results were overwhelmingly positive. Most sending households perceive that this scheme, the participation in this scheme, has been positive on their households. The graph that you see here, divided by the scheme, show that the majority of these households see that the participation has been very positive or positive on the households. Some of them say it's neutral, and a minority says has negative impact on the family. There's little difference when we break down by gender of the workers, but overall, the story is still a positive story. And when we ask workers in particular about how do they perceive the impact of participating in this scheme on their marital relationship and the relationship with their kids at home, the majority of them say, it's still positive. And there's very little difference between male and females. So on the first graph here is about marital relationships, about more than 69% of male and 62% of females say the participation has positive impact on their marriage. About a fourth says it has negative impact, and some say there's no change at all. And more than 80% of them, both male and female, say it has a positive impact on the relationship with their children, which is very interesting. And most non-migrant households, these are the households that have no workers. They do not participate in this scheme, but they live in the same communities, and we interview them. We ask their perception about the impact of labor mobilities on their communities, and the majority of them say the impact is either very positive, the blue one here, or positive, the orange here. Only a minority say they perceive a negative or very negative impact, which is the light blue or the dark gray at the very top here. You can barely see it. Okay, and when we ask these households for the reason why they perceive the negative impact or the positive impact, for positive impact, they point to better relationship, new skills, improved infrastructure in the communities, more entrepreneurships, more money for for the household, more money for the churches. And what is interesting is the result, the feedback are highly similar between the standing household, the workers' household, and the household that do not participate in these schemes. Same for negative impact. The feedback are very similar between these two groups of households, and they point to more violent women, alcohol abuse, poor relationship among household members, poor children care, and less motivation to work locally, or less workers to work in the local market. When we compare these quantitative findings with the qualitative in-depth interview, we also find the synergies and consistency there. The standing household and communities do perceive some social costs. They were not shying away from speaking their mind about those costs, but the overall perception is that the social benefit outweighs the cost. So there's a net social gain there. There seems to be a consensus about the positive economic impact, the economic gains from this scheme. There were many reported accounts of positive relation impact, as well as changing in the gender norms, with women feeling more empowered, more agency, more confidence, gaining better control and access to family decision making and finance. But there are also many accounts of negative impact on relationships, including family breakdown. And there were some reports of localized labor shortage, especially in rural communities where a large share of the adults of the working force migrate to work in this scheme. So just to recap the takeaway given the time, the survey that we have conducted, the Pacific Labor Mobility Survey, supports and echoes and extends on positive and pure evidence on the economic gains and benefits of labor mobilities, including in terms of income, remittances, and job satisfaction. The majority of the workers were very satisfied overall and across many different dimensions of working conditions and the experience in the host country. But specific issues exist, and there's room for improvement there. And together with the qualitative study, we found a net social benefit. Although, as we acknowledged earlier, there's certainly areas and cases for issues that need to be addressed. So as a concluding remark, I want to acknowledge the support and funding from DFAT for this survey that has helped the collaboration between the World Bank and the Development Policy Center at ANU in the last couple of years. I also want to deeply thank the time, the effort, the support and patience of all the respondents to the survey, thousands of them, our survey field teams, our government partners in Australia, in New Zealand, in Tonga, in Kiribati, in Vanuatu, the PLF, employers and community organization in helping us to facilitate these projects. And thank you for your attention. Vinaka.
Thank you, Ryan and Jung. That was very interesting research. This is very timely. And I know policymakers were looking at what's the impact or social and economic impact of labor mobility. And we look forward to the final report. Next up, we have Chung Nguyen and Ryan Edwards. And they're going to present on labor market impacts of low-skill temporary migration, evidence from seasonal worker programs. Are you going to start, Ryan?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's me again. I'm just going to really briefly introduce this one. Tuan is the star, make no mistake. Here. So this paper is a new one. We're very excited about it. It's quite early days. It's basically the first kind of serious evidence that we have on the impacts of these schemes in Australia on the labour markets back home, which is a very timely issue in Australia at the moment. So the question that we're asking is a pretty simple one. It's how does temporary immigration of workers in really key sectors, typically at the lower end of the skills spectrum, affect the incumbent workers, so native workers, wages and their occupational choices? What's going on there? So there's a long history of papers and work and debates on immigration that center around this, right? About other people coming in, taking your jobs, holding your wages down, things like that. So this paper is looking at the SWP and the PLS collectively as the Palm Scheme visas. As everyone knows, I don't need to give background, but the starting dates were 2012 and 2019 respectively. Everyone in this room knows what type of jobs they mostly are. But what I want to emphasize today is that these are findings from administrative data that actually covers the entire Australian population. So it's tax and visa records. So it's incredibly precise, which is a luxury we have not had yet when looking at these things. So what we're going to do today is first largely introduce the data, give you some descriptive statistics about what the admin data says about who's where and what's going on. And then we're going to estimate the effects of the SWP and PLS on the wages of the Australian workers that are most plausibly exposed to the schemes in their workplace. Then we're going to look a little bit about a key potential mechanism of adjustment, which is that of occupational mobility, whether people move to different jobs. And so to cut straight to the chase, to the findings, we don't really find any evidence that SWP and PLS suppress the wages of Australian workers in the occupations exposed. Like most of the modern literature, the effects are approximately zero in the careful good studies, and we find quite similar. It's very, very tiny positive effect, but it's absolutely tiny. Workers in the most exposed occupations as well. This is only descriptive. We've got a lot more work to do on this, are incredibly mobile. They've got amongst the highest rates of occupational change in the entire Australian economy. But people who are leaving these sectors are experiencing very large wage gains, almost doubling. But we need to do a lot more work to expand on that. So the rest of this talk is going to I'm going to give you a really brief theoretical background on how we tend to think about this as economists and how we should think about it, whereas sometimes this doesn't happen, I think, in the popular debates. Then Tuan's going to introduce the data and then talk you through all the details and all the really substantive stuff. So how does immigration actually affect native wages and employment? Well, the most traditional view you can think of as a downward sloping demand curve, and as you move right along that curve with the price of wages on the left-hand side and more supply comes in, wages are naturally falling down. That's the Econ 101 definition that sort of is invoked around the world to justify nativist labour market policies, certain types of immigration policies focusing on particular sectors, and it also invokes the well-known lump of labour fallacy, which is that there's some fixed amount of work to do and that once you have more people in, there's not going to be more work. They don't actually create more demand. The empirical view on this, though, economics is largely a data and empirical social science now, and it's become much more scientific over the last 30 years than it ever was before that. It started with sort of the seminal study that's been much debated on the Mariel boat lift, which was the Marielitos being sort of coming into Miami from Cuba. And this has been interrogated really nicely. It was the first natural experiment on this that did find this sort of zero effect. Many studies since then, probably the most important one focusing on temporary work in the US and the exclusion of the braceros was by Mark Michael, who you heard from before, which also finds similar, and it finds mechanical adaptation. So the more modern view that sort of incorporates and responds to what these sort of reduced form empirical studies find is actually it's complicated. Many factors push in heaps of different directions. We know that immigrants also increase demand themselves. They tend to work in different sectors to locals, so you need to be careful on how you think about it. And there's often complementarity in having them in place, whether that's through things like task specialization and occupational upgrading. So the question then, which of these views holds for Australia? We've got pretty unique labour market institutions there. They're very heavily regulated, unlike a lot of other countries where most of this evidence comes from, like the US. My colleague Bob Brunick has a paper with some others that does find no effect, but it uses a national skill level approach. And it uses a survey data set that doesn't actually track or record immigrants all that well. Called the Hilda data set. And then there's another recent paper that also uses Hilda, but it links in high skilled visas and it finds slight evidence of wage increases and specialization. But what do we find for these lower skilled workers? Well, over to Tuan.
Thank you very much, Ryan. With the advancement, the improvement in data integration and coordination from several departments of several Australian government departments, we are now having the capacity to provide the empirical evidence based on administrative data of Australia. So in 2019, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the I.T.S, established a secure platform that integrates and coordinates the data from different government agencies. The data is named Multi-Agency data integration platform in briefly that MADIP that provide access to the Australian administrative data, and that contains the data, the information on health, education, visas, travelers, government payments, income and taxation from the ATO, the Australian Taxation Office, employment and population demographics, including the census. And this is the longitudinal data that cover entire Australian populations from 2000 to 2022. In this paper, we employ three models of the MADIP. The first is the Australian Taxation Office individual tax returns data. And the second, the Home Affairs visa models that records the visa granted in 20 years in Australia, and the traveler models that track the arrivals in and out to Australia. And we track the individuals in 2 years, 2011 and 2019. With the scope of this paper, we track only those Australians who have a positive wage and employed in the 2 years, 2011 and 2019. So we have around like 6.8 million Australians in the panel data. The reason for tracking that in 2011 and 2019, because 2011 is the years before, right before the establishment of the SWP. Meanwhile, 2019 is the peak years of the SWP program and the POS program right before the COVID. And we use the Home Affairs data to identify who are POS and SWP workers. For example, we can identify 14,000, about 14,000 of the SWP POS visas that granted in 2019. The ideas of evaluating the impacts, the labor market impacts, is to compare the group that exposed to the programs with similar groups that do not expose to the programs. So we define our set of workers to three subsets, a subgroup. The group one, that the SWP POS exposed workers. That's the one who work in the occupation with more than 50 SWP POS immigrants in 2019, based on the 6-digit ASCO code. For one who may not familiar with the Australian system, the ASCO is the occupation classification of Australian government. And the group two, that are laborers, that the one who work in the occupation with 1-digit ASCO code equal to 8, or they are laborers, they are low-skilled workers, minus the group one because that's a treated group. And group three, that on other workers, that on workers excluding the group one. Before moving to the evaluation, we need to know some basic characteristics of the SWP POS migrants. So the data in the chart show us the numbers of visa granted of the two visa scheme from 2017 to 2021. 2021. So we can see that in 2017 we have around 7,000 visa granted. It quickly increased and reached a peak in 14,000 visa granted in 2019 before it dropped to about like just about 4,000 visa because of the COVID in 2020 and recover to around like 14,000 again in 2021. The POS scheme established in 2019 and quickly expanded, and in 2021 is accounted for about 30% of the total SWP POS workers. In terms of occupations, most visa grantees are under the occupation that the farm, forestry, garden workers. This is based on the 2-digit ASCO classification, and followed by the factory process workers. On the occupation in this list are laborers with 1-digit ASCO code equal to 8, except the hospitality workers, which is accounted for about 0.76% of the total visa granted. The visa model doesn't contain the information about the state of residence and tender, so I need to employ the traveler models. The data in the chart tell us about the gender balance of the programs. So the two programs are quite male biased, and Tasmania is a state had the best gender balance. Queensland is the state that receives the most visas with around like 4,000 visa granted in the fiscal year 18-19. In terms of the source of the immigrants, three biggest sources are Vanuatu, Tonga, and Timor-Leste, with Vanuatu accounted for about 35% of the total visa granted in 2019, or about 5,000 visa granted. We want to know the contribution of the SWP POS to the workforce in the occupation that exposed to the workers. So in 2019, for example, farm, forestry, garden workers occupation, we have about 9,300 visa granted, compared to the total workforce of 105,000 workers in the total in this occupation. In reality terms, the farm, forestry, garden workers in this occupation, the SWP POS workers accounted for 8.8%, followed by the factory process workers. The SWP POS accounted for 0.9%, which is pretty small. And we know about some basic characteristics of the SWP POS workers. The point is that we want to know the impacts on wage of Australian incumbents. First, we will provide some descriptive statistics. This figure shows us the real wage of three groups of Australian incumbents that we defined in the slide earlier, and their wage in 2011 and 2019. So the first group are the workers that are exposed to the SWP POS programs. We see that in 2011, their average wage is about 31,000 Australian dollar, compared to other laborers, that 36,000 Australian dollar. So these occupation has a lower wage in the year before the establishment of the SWP. On other Australian workers, this group has an average wage of 52,000. After 8 years, in 2019, we see the significant increase in wage of these three groups. And based on this figure, we don't see any evidence that the SWP POS suppressed the wage of Australian incumbents in the group of workers that exposed to immigrants to the programs. In terms of relative change, we see that the workers exposed to the SWP POS programs gained 72.26% in 8 years. Laborers gained 71%, and all other workers gained 65.65%. So we can see that no evidence on the suppression of the programs on wage of Australian incumbents. To establish the causal estimation, we need 4 averages. The average of the treatment group and the control group before and after the programs. Here we have 4 averages already. And we need 3 subtraction. That we need the change of the treated group, we take the change of the treated group minus the change of the control group. The change is a subtraction. So we have 3 subtractions. And we can implement it with the details of the data. We have an individual level data with occupation, details information on occupation. We can implement with the statistical inference. So the model, I put everything in the model, economists like model. So in the left-hand side, we have a dependent variable that the ways of individual I's work in the occupation J in year T. We control for individual fixed effects because different people have different family backgrounds and maybe have different abilities that may affect wage. And we control for the occupation fixed effects because some occupation has lower wage than other occupation. And we control for post year fixed effect that control for the business cycles. And our key variables of interest are the interactions of treated multiplied to post. Treated equal is the indicator that equal to 1 if the occupation has 50 SWP POS workers in 2019 based on the 6 degrees R score. And the beta here is our coefficient of interest. We have the panel data of non-SWP POS workers in 2011, 2019, and we track the individuals. So this is the panel data. And we have the control group, that is group 2, the laborers with 1 degrees R score cost equal to 8. In 2019, we have around 427,000 workers in the control group and 93,000 workers in the treated groups. And in the treated occupation, the SWP POS accounted for around 11.37% of the total workforce. The results in model. In the left-hand side, in the first column, we don't include the occupation fixed effects. We don't control for characteristics such as age. So we see that the effects of SWP POS on wage of incumbents is 8.7%. When we control for occupation fixed effect, that's about 3.3% in 8 years. So that's very, very small. But that's positive, not negative. There are several reasons to explain for this positive. Maybe because the business increase the productivity, they pay higher wage, or they expand their activities. In the next phase, Ryan will explore more about occupational upgrades of the Australian incumbents.
You're going to finish. Okay, fine. Sorry, more from me then. Okay. So job switching. This is only descriptive evidence because we're very much still working on this. I just want to stress. So the period from 2011 to 19 appeared to witness a huge amount of low-skilled workers in Australia upgrade their occupations. And what's interesting about these sectors as well, what's really important is the age profile, right? When you're younger, you're more likely to move into slightly more skilled jobs and things like this. In our estimation sample, this rate of change was largest for SWP PLS exposed occupations relative to labourers and relative to all other workers. So if you look at these rates of change, you've got 26 versus 18 versus almost nothing. So huge rates of change in these exposed sectors, whether the schemes are causing this rate of change, whether the schemes are going to and recruiting from areas where there were shortages and where people would not want to work. These are not questions that we can answer at this stage. As I'll say at the bottom in that caveat there. But yes, what's the actual wages like though in these sectors that people are leaving? So the workers in our sample, remember, it's the universe of individuals that are filing positive tax earnings in both years. For those who have moved out of the exposed sectors, they're typically more than doubling their earnings. Remember, everyone else is getting growth too. So all the wages are increasing, but these guys are doubling, which is higher than the growth rates you saw before. So 61 versus 71% up to 124. And yeah, as I mentioned down the bottom, I'll just say once more, the descriptive evidence doesn't tell us whether PLS-SWP is causing these movements, whether it's preventing natives from taking jobs in the exposed occupations, or whether these movements were simply just going to happen anyway. But still, huge gains and definitely something that's worth looking into more because this is, yeah, big issue. Concluding, what we have done today, I'm mindful of time. We have used the admin data to look at the impacts and to provide a little descriptive evidence on mobility. Found no real convincing evidence that the schemes have held down domestic wages, rather slightly small positive effects. And the occupational mobility numbers are quite large and warrant a much more careful econometric investigation. But if we put these two talks that we've given now today together, we know that the workers themselves are getting quite massive gains, quite big earnings gains. So the two, when you think about which workers are affected, it's the affected ones as the incumbents, and then it's the ones coming. So we are seeing basically do no harm. We're seeing gains for the workers and then small gains for those that are leaving, and small gains for those that are already in the sectors, but potentially huge gains for those that are not working in the sectors as a result of other people working in them. And quick next steps in case anyone was worried, this and caveat. So this is a pretty narrow comparison focusing on the occupations that are most effective. Part of our motivation for doing that was if you're going to see anything in the data, that's where we would see it rather than in the whole population or in a whole local labour market. And this type of a design does invoke an assumption of no spillovers. It doesn't account for what we call in economics as general equilibrium effects, where different parts of the sector all respond and we have to account for all of those dynamics. It's a really simple static exercise. And of course, it's difficult for us to rule out other things happening only in these exposed occupations over time, but we've got a bit in that model to try and account for those things. And you can see what we're going to be focusing on next. So focusing on this mobility issue, looking at occupational shifts, looking at local labour markets in a bit more detail, and then importantly, linking it into the business data to find out who these firms are, what's going on in terms of productivity, turnovers, their internal behaviours and optimization think within the firm. But yeah, thank you for giving me so much time and for both of the panels so far. I'll hand back to Nilesh. All right, great, thanks.
Thanks, Ryan. And next up, we have Hiroshi Maeda going to present on temporary migration and household spending in the Pacific. And Ryan Edwards is also an author, but Ryan is a supervisor, so he's not going to present. It'll only be Hiroshi. Over to you, man.
Rabinaka, Marutawa Pongini, and good morning, everyone. I am Hiroshi Maeda from ANUs. I'm here to talk about my master dissertation about temporary migration and expenditure patterns in Tonga. So I have 5 topics today. First, I start with background research questions explaining why Tonga provided ideal setting for my studies. Also data, empirical strategy, explaining how I deal with biases. Also main results showing that temporary migration supports basic consumption rather than investment. I also present heterogeneous impact, highlighting the difference across SWP and RSE and gender of migrants. And I finish my presentation with caveat and conclusions. So the last presenter showing the social impact and income gains. So now we are interested in how the recipient of remittance in labor sending countries spend it and how it's circulated in the economies. The economists have long thought there are 2 competitive views. One is remittance used for business investment, therefore it is conducive for economic growth. On the other hand, remittance used for basic consumptions, so it is not conducive for economic growth in general. And SWP and IRC and PLS are partly framed based on remittance investment narratives, which means remittance used for business investment, and it is conducive for economic growth. But we don't have a very good evidence based on rigorous impact evaluations. Also, there's another interest in wide range of economic literatures. There's a lot of government-to-government temporary migration program outside Oceania. And past studies show that temporary migration increased expenditure level of various goods, including food, education, health, durable goods, housing, but not temptation goods like alcohol and tobacco. So this research will provide one comparative evidence in this regard. So Tonga provides an ideal setting because of 2 reasons. First, remittance play a key role in the Tonga economy. Tonga is long known for the remittance-dependent economies. And into 2022, the GDP remittance ratio in Tonga is the highest in the world. Also, Tongan migrants have actively participated in SWP and RSE, shown in the bottom figures. So in this research, I examine how does temporary migration affect expenditure level and the allocation of spending within migrant sending household in Tonga. So I use first round of Pacific labor mobility surveys, but I only use face-to-face survey collected from November 2020 to January 2021. This is because informed surveys in full survey, there's some drop in expenditure, for example, like business investment education, if I remember correctly. But it's the face-to-face data include rich information about household and individual, enabling me to do the impact evaluations. It includes household demography, education, income, expenditure level of 25 goods shown in the slide. Also asset ownership, temporary migration status, which is treatment in these studies. So if I describe a treatment status, there's a 123 household participating SWP, 44 household in PLS, and 176 household in RSC. On the other hand, in the control group, around 70% household without migrant have never participated or applied to any migration programs. Also, temporary migration program is known for male-dominating participations, which is consistent with the number of the migrants in surveys. 421 households have male migrants. On the other hand, only 122 households has a female migrant. So this is my empirical strategies. So in this study, I estimate the average treatment effect on the treated, but self-selection migration causes bias. Maybe so the household have different motivations for moving to Australia, New Zealand. So maybe if we compare the pinky duck with the yellow duck, it is like a different, even without migrations. So it causes biases in this study. But in temporary migration program, workers are selected based on limited number of observed characteristics such as age, genders, English, also past participation because of the direct employment. So if we can extract the data for participations from surveys, maybe we could find the yellow and yellow duck, and then we can compare first, and then taking difference, and then we can reduce the bias by comparing at local level, not at the global level. So before going to the main result, I'd like to introduce how Tongan migrants spend money. There are two main expenditures. One is food consumption at home, around 150 per anga. And the other one is community spending, such as donation to church and village, around 300 per anga. Also, they spend around 40 to 75 per anga to housing, food and right, which is utility, and vehicle. If we look at the budget shares, the highest one is food consumption at home at around 30%, followed by 25% for community spendings. Also, they spend 5.5% for food consumption outside home, and around 8% for food and light and vehicles. Okay, so this is my main results. Main results start from total expenditure and spending. So I find the migrant and households save remittance rather than spending them. So temporary migration increased saving by 38.1%. On the other hand, there is no significant and positive impact for total expenditures. We move to expenditure level. Also, I first find the positive impact on aggregate basic consumptions, including food consumption at home, food side at home, and daily necessities, around 15.6%, but there's no impact on investments. I also find positive impact on housing by 23.7%. Also, temporary migration increased expenditure level of non-durable goods by 21.5%, health 80.1%, recreation 8.3%, gambling 6.3%, education 24.7%, and lending money 22.8%. But on the other hand, temporary migration decreased the expenditure level of special events such as funeral or wedding by 24.0%. If we move to budget shares, this is a some reflection from the change in expenditure level. So temporary migration shifts up the budget share of the aggregate basic consumption by 3.3 percentage points. but there's no significant impact on investment. Also, there's a relatively small but a positive shift in housing by 1.2 percentage points. Also, there's a slight increase in the budget share of education, 0.6 percentage points, but temporary migration decreased the budget share of community spending by 2.9 percentage point. But well, there's a one migrant is absent from Tonga. So if the number of household member is determinant of community spending, then it is obvious it's decreasing. Also, temporary migration can send money directly to the church or communities. So key takeaway from my main result is temporary migration is a source of basic consumptions, but it also helps to finance other expenditures such as housing and education. Also, food consumption shift toward consumption outside home from the consumption at home. This might lead to the higher nutritious food intakes if the food provided in restaurant is more nutritious. This is a robustness check. So briefly speaking, we can find a good match with cross chance of participations, which is shown in the two figures below. Also, the main result about basic consumptions and investment looks similar across different way of evaluations. Okay, now I want to move to the heterogeneous impact. But please be careful that when I split the sample, the total sample size becomes smaller. This leads to the results more imprecise. So I will start with SWP and RSE. I cannot show you the result on PLS because there's only 44 households, so it's not big enough to do the analysis. So I find the both program increase basic consumptions, but there's no impact on investments. And only RSE increase housing, the expenditure level of housing by 38.6% and durable goods by 38.4%. RSE also increase the expenditure level of non-durable goods by 35.2% and health by 30.3%. On the other hand, RSE increase the expenditure level of education by 33.0% and gambling by 8.1%. Aside from basic consumptions, RSE and SWP and RSE both increase expenditure level of recreations and lending monies. For the budget shares, again, both programs increase the basic consumptions, but there's no impact on investment. Only RSE increased budget share of housing by 1.9 percentage points. But only RSE increased the budget share of education by 0.6 percentage points, but decreased the budget share of community spending by 3.1 percentage points. So key takeaways. So SWP and RSE both support basic consumptions, which is good. But they can also have a heterogeneous impact on expenditure patterns. But this is just first round surveys, so this can be just snapshot. So we have to keep investigating whether this heterogeneous impact persists over time. So as for the gender of migrant, I would like to focus on the impact on food consumptions. So when migrant is female, the impact on food consumption are different. The graph shows that only when female is migrant, food consumption at home increase very, very large. And the impact on subsistence agriculture might explain it because significant or the impact on subsistence agricultures or engagement of home crop productions only very small and insignificant when migrants are females. As for budget shares, it is pretty similar. There's a very large impact on food consumption at home. Also, there's a larger impact on basic consumptions. But I suspect that when migrant is female, temporary migration doesn't increase the expenditure level of health, non-durable goods, recreations, and lending monies. So the impact on budget share is a relative change of all budget, all expenditure goods. So maybe This difference explains the largest shifts in basic consumptions. I would also like to highlight the heterogeneous impact on savings. Only SWP increased saving by 53.7%, maybe because of higher level of remittance. Also, when migrant are female, temporary migration does not increase saving. This is interesting. Maybe there's no significant impact on expenditure level. So maybe those husband or male member of household in Tonga keep remittance by cash. They just don't go to the bank to save money. And this is a caveat. Well, the result can be still biased due to unobserved factors. I cannot control any innate characteristic of household. Also, some of the outcomes are still sensitive to selection matching methods, as shown in the bottom. The expenditure level of community and educations become insignificant or sometimes flip the sign of the coefficient, which is concerning. So in conclusions, the evidence finds that temporary migration increased expenditure level and budget share of basic consumptions, but no investments, which support remittance consumption narrative in Oceania, temporary migration in Oceania. Thus, in my view, framing of temporary migration program should weight more on consumption side, not business investment. And if policymakers really want to connect temporary migration remittance with business investment, we really have to think what causes business investment in Tonga or more broadly in the Pacific regions, as we discussed yesterday. Also, policymakers in New Zealand argue that repeated migration shifts primary spending of remittance from consumption of goods or service to education, health, housing to the investment. And then my research finds a slight increase in housing and education. So now the Tongan migrant, Tongan household could be the transitioning stage from basic consumption to housing and education. Malo Pito.
Thank you, Hiroshi. The three presentations provide very interesting research around Pacific labor mobility. These are some of the questions that have been continuously asked since the beginning of the labor migration program. For instance, what's the impact on workers' perspectives, the impact or the social impact on households from where these workers come from, but also what's the impact on the labor market in Australia and New Zealand. So I think these papers provide very interesting research and answers to some of those questions. We can now open up the floor for any questions or in discussion. We have around 10 minutes. So, yep, we'll start off with a question here. Please introduce yourself, then you can ask your question or make a comment.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you for all the presenters. It was a very interesting findings. My name is Prita from the ANU. I have a question for Hiroshi. You have a very interesting findings there. Although like the finding on the community is very minimal and it can flips also, you know, like the sign between negative and positive. But I think in the descriptive at the beginning, you show like a very high proportion of community spending, which is like 25%. So, I mean, maybe it's not really related to the impact evaluation, but what do you think could be, you know, like why there's a high share of community spending? Was that something related to the limited access of people to the formal insurance, for example? I think, I mean, based on my experience in Indonesia, I mean, that can be the case sometimes. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Hiroshi.
In Tonga, so most households are Christian. So they go to church every Sunday, they donate money. So generally, I think Tongan household donate a lot of money. And then it also connect to kind of dignities or the, like, you know, respect to the church. So I think that's one reason that Tongan households spend 25%. And also, like a lot of research already show that Tongan migrants send a lot of money directly to church, like to rebuild, or like there's some events like a church conference or like a missionary. A missionary is a event to donate a lot of money to church, and then feeling the spiritual connections from the daily life to the ordinary life of Tonga to like the practices in the church. So yeah, I think like those cultural factors driving the results.
Yeah, one in the middle and then that side. We'll go with the one in the middle first, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I thought the results and the findings presented in all three papers is very interesting. My name is Manuel. I am a current student with the university, and I take economics and politics. I wanted to focus on the second paper, which was the impact of the seasonal workers program and the Pacific Labor Scheme on the Australian market. And I do understand that, at this point, while there is a correlation between increased wages for incumbents in Australia in relation to the increased visa acceptance, maybe it's too early to ascertain a causation. But I just wanted to focus on at the policymaking level, especially from Australia's side, to what extent then should policymakers consider the correlation presented in your study, especially now where there's an increased need for Australia to further their cooperation with the Pacific region under the Buvalu partnership. So, at that level, at the policy level, should this be good grounds to increase such schemes, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Ryan, I think,
Thank you very much for your great questions. I'm an economist, I'm a researcher, I'm not policy maker, so I couldn't do much in that scope, but I think that at least there's no need to worry that immigrants from the Pacific, from the PALM scheme, suppress the waste of Australian workers. We need to do more to investigate the effects of the business to have more comprehensive pictures. But at least at this stage, we are quite sure that we don't have the evidence for the suppression on waste of the two schemes. So politicians, they may convince the public that's okay, we don't need to worry about the negative impacts of the two schemes. The immigrants bring more benefits rather than the loss to the Australian workers.
Ryan, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'm just comment much more broadly, perhaps less on engagement with the region, because I would leave that to be decided by the people who are deciding that. But Australia just had a big review of its immigration system back home undertaken. And the theme of that was, like, Australia is already one of the most skill selective visa countries in the world. And a key theme of that was making that even more selective, bringing in wage floors for people who would like to come and work in Australia due to fears that lower skilled wages were getting held down. And there's no evidence to support that, right? Both internationally, the broader literature, and there's not that much in Australia that has been done. And I guess we're hoping to make a first contribution to that, which suggests that a lot of those fears are not correct. And at least for now, we can somewhat confidently say that that's certainly not the case for these two schemes. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Question there.
Yeah, my name is Kalinga Seniran. I'm a visiting lecturer at USP. Just a comment about what was mentioned. My son, who was born and bred in Australia, is a graduate, business studies graduate. And he often tells me, I don't want to compete for these shit jobs because the wages for graduates have come down because of the 2-year visa. But I'm not talking about that time. I want to talk about the Pacific context, because this session was supposed to be economics impact at home and abroad. I thought you will look at the countries, because, for example, what I find today, I noticed in Fiji. Fiji's been, especially Fiji's health system, has been devastated by the nurses who have been migrating mainly to Australia and New Zealand. Over 800 last year, and in the first 6 months, over 800 have gone. And the tourism sector has been impacted. Even the meat workers have been taken by Australia. And also many other drivers even. Now, looking at it from a country to basis, I'm just wondering if there's any studies been done, because what you presented were the individual at family level. Individuals get higher wages, like the Tongan study, it has increased consumption back home. But what's happening in Fiji, I find it's a serious economic issue. Previous time there will be enough Australian media and journalists and researchers saying it's been economic mismanagement by the Fijian government. But is it really economic mismanagement when Australia is taking away a lot of people who have been trained, educated and trained in Fiji? How do you see it as a Pacific relationship between neighbors?
I think you made your point. We'll let the panelists answer.
Take the controversial one for fun. I would put that question like that, latch onto that last bit of what you said about Australia taking away, focusing on the countries rather than the individuals, right? I think it's important to focus on workers themselves and people moving whether they decide to. The best evidence that we have for Fiji was done by a good friend of mine, probably of many of you in the room, Professor Satish Chand from ADFA, and Michael, who you heard from this morning, that looked at the effects of the coup in the 80s on skill accumulation and brain drain issues. That's the only really good paper on this brain drain concerns. And yeah, I would encourage everyone to have a look at it. But it finds that people disproportionately went to go and get the skills to move abroad in places like USP and elsewhere. Really convincing evidence of a brain gain over the medium term in these sectors. I mean, I don't want to hear people rabbiting on about that, but we do need more recent stuff like this of that level of quality to really unpack what's going on at the firm adjustment level, how they're adjusting. Because if firms are increasing domestic wages, my view as an economist is that's probably a good thing. Like wage growth isn't bad, right? Yeah, like so. Yeah, that's an issue for firms and elsewhere to deal with. Like wage growth is a good thing normally. Yeah.
Thank you, Ryan. Any other member of the panelists? No. Okay. So I yeah, question here.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Joe. I have a question for the lady presenter. You said in your presentation that more than half of the people you interviewed were not happy with deductions. And we assume these are things like board, rent, utilities, and transport, and so forth. And some of them have vented their frustrations or relayed their experiences on social media. We've seen all that. So the first question is, bearing in mind the kind of contractual obligations they may be under in the class of visa, is there any redress or remedies for them to complain to the authorities about the employers? And do you know of any successful compensation claims? And the second question is, in the recruitment processes back home, are deductions, do they know about the deductions so that they can make, good economic decisions? Logically, the reason why they're going is that they want to be adequately remunerated to remit money back home to improve their living standards. And if that's not the case, from the various research methods that you used, that even for some of them, if it was not economically viable, would they still go because of the positive impacts you mentioned, like living in a new country, experiencing a new culture, and learning new skills and so forth?
Thank you for your question. Let me try to break this down a little bit. I think the issues of the deductions is this. For the current arrangement of this scheme is that there are some costs that worker have to pay upfront before they depart to work in Australia or New Zealand. And then there are certain costs that will be recouped by the employers over the duration of their employment. So when a workers express dissatisfaction with the deductions, and when they feel that it is either unfair or it is not clear to them, whether it's too much, it's intransparent. One way to address this is to make sure that they are well aware of what to expect when they arrive in the host country. Workers are expected and are required to take pre-departure briefing and pre-departure training before they left their own country. So one way to address this risk of them feeling unsatisfied is to make sure that they know what to expect in terms of deduction, what will be deducted, how much and how regular it is out of their regular earning before they arrive in the host country. That will help them to manage their own expectation in how they cope with life here. In terms of your second question of whether they still want to come, I think our data show a very clear income gain that these workers experience, even after taxes, after all of this deduction, they gain more than what they would have gained in their domestic market. And the expression from the workers themselves show that a large share of them want to come back to work, for more seasons before they stop and stay at home or come here, come to Australia and New Zealand for a longer term reason. So I would say that the deduction here, at least solely from the data that we see, is not, it doesn't seem to be a deterrent factors that prevent workers to participate in these schemes, or at least not as a sole reason. It is an issue that has been raised by the workers, so we are aware of it, and there are measures that need to be done to address it. One, to make sure that they know what to expect, and they are clear about their contractual obligation on what to do with these deductions. I'm not going to comment on whether these deductions are fair or unfair, because again, this is part of the contract and part of the arrangements. There are costs that employers paid upfront for the workers, and then they recoup it back. And there are costs like insurance, accommodation, and other arrangements. So management of expectation is one thing, and then reviewing, whether these deductions, how these deductions are done and managed is another.
Thank you. We had a late tea, so we'll take two more questions. You have a comment?
Yeah, I'll make two really brief points. So on trying to do the numbers on how much you're earning, sending back and all that, we have it, I don't think there's any households in the data that are actually sending back less than prior earnings, and on average it's around a third. So when you think about the shares, the money that's being sent back is usually approximately equal to what they were earning back home, sometimes much more, sometimes it's being saved and then spent. So just on the remittance quantity, yeah, we've got much more to say on that soon in the main report. On the deduction, so it's not that well known or necessarily utilized, but my understanding is that there is a provision and workers can opt out of some deductions to go organize them themselves. And I think that's a live issue that could be explored more, right? Letting people choose where to live, because you might not necessarily, you might want to go stay somewhere cheaper or go into share housing, especially if you're in a big city with lots of other Fijians or friends around, like a lot of people in Melbourne now, for example. And the same goes with choosing health insurance. There might, yeah, I think my sense of what the government is doing back home is putting more choice for the workers and a bit more agency, in which I think would probably be welcome given a lot of what we've been hearing.
So yeah, a question from the gentleman here, and then the last question from the lady this side.
Hi, my name is Jonas Maxwell. I work with Pacific Work Support based in Australia. We work with civic workers that are disgruntled or disengaged. So I'm listening with interest in all the comments here. My question, which is many, and I work very intimately with a lot of these workers, in terms of a case I had last week, domestic violence, where the Fijian lady was beaten up. We work with workers that have passed away. It's about closing their estates and things like that. However, my question here is, has anyone thought of you lovely people here about giving the Indigenous workers a contract in their native language? Is a contract given to a Fijian worker when before he leaves, written out in Fijian? Thank you. I'll be here to take any questions from anyone.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not an answer to your question, but I can say that all of our surveys were administered in local language with local enumerators. I'm not sure of the nature of the contracts whenever they're done. Like here, I understand it's facilitated through the NEC and through the employers and so forth, but I can't say. I obviously think it would be a good idea.
But what's your experience? You have been working closely with the workers. What's your experience? Have they been given contract in their local language? No. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. All right. We'll go with the last question. Yeah.
Okay, so Malole, I'm Tapo from, obviously from Tonga. So I just want to acknowledge and say thank you to the presenters for a very informative presentation this morning. I think it's a topic of very much interest to all of us, but specifically for me because Hiroshi had presented in Tonga, on Tonga. I think for me personally, the findings from your researchers is particularly interesting because it pretty much contradicts, and again, this is from my personal perspective, contradicts a lot of the anecdotal stories that we hear around the Pacific, but particularly in Tonga. And again, with the previous presentations from Malaysia this morning, where there was information shared with regards to restricting the seasonal worker scheme in Samoa for a particular time. And then coming back to the presentations now, where a lot of the feedback is positive with regards to the employers and the accommodations. So the satisfaction survey that was presented this morning, in thinking it is a bit contradictory to an extent. My question, I didn't really catch it, Hiroshi, is you had mentioned that you had chosen to do your study on Tonga for a specific reason. I didn't actually catch it, but could you please mention that again? Can you just clarify that again, please?
Thank you for questions. I chose to study Tonga is data because well, we have Vanuatu Tonga Kiribati data, but only Tongan data with face-to-face survey. Ask question about 25 expenditure goods. Also, I lived in Tonga for 2 years before COVID, so I'm particularly have a passion on your countries. So that's why I chose Tonga to do it.
Malo.
Okay, thank you. So that's all the time we have. I'll bring this discussion to a close now. You have a comment to make? Okay.
I just want to make a general comment about the difference or the seemingly contradiction between survey or what we've presented today and stories that has been reported. So what I see in terms of the value of having a survey that what we have presented is to give an overview pictures based on 1,000 or a large number of responses from the workers, from the household who are directly involved in these schemes. So the finding that we presented and the survey that we do is not to dismiss or invalidate stories of exploitation, of harassment or of bad cases. We are not trying to contradict those. We acknowledge that these cases do exist, and we have heard from them. We have heard about those stories from our past survey experience as well, from some of the workers, from some of the household, from some of the employers themselves, as well as liaison officers from the standing countries. But I think what we want to show is an overall pictures based on a large number of responses from a large number of people that overall things are okay. Things are still good, but there are minorities of negative cases that do exist and they need to be addressed. What we are not trying to say that everything is good, all of those bad news on the media are wrong or are invalid or they are not significant. They are there, they need to be addressed, but please do keep in mind they are still the minority based on the data that we have found. So we do not want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I just want to make that general comment here.
Yeah, thank you, Joan. Let's please join me in thanking all the panelists. So we'll break for lunch now, and panel 8 will start at 1 p.m. sharp in this room. Just a housekeeping matter. Someone left a USB here yesterday, and it says Pacific Security College with a bunch of keys. So if it's yours, please collect it from the podium here. Thank you. Yeah.
Before you go, can I just get a few 3 minutes of your time?
Yeah.
Just to get a few comments about the whole